The devil doesn't need to shatter your windows if he can simply convince you to unlatch the front door. The winter that year in the White Mountains of New Hampshire was not just cold. It was a physical, suffocating weight that pressed down on the timberlines and buried the logging roads under feet of dead, gray ice. We lived completely off the grid, 20 miles outside the dying township of Blackwood. My husband, Arthur, was a foreman at the lumber mill, and we had built a quiet, isolated, and profoundly happy life in a massive log cabin nestled deep within the suffocating embrace of the ancient pine forests. We were a good family. We were honest, hardworking, and deeply devoted to one another. I see now, with the agonizing clarity of hindsight, that our inherent goodness was exactly what made us the perfect prey. It was past midnight on a brutally frigid Tuesday. Arthur and I were driving our heavy Ford pickup back up the winding, treacherous mountain pass after making a late-night supply run to the pharmacy in town. The heater in the truck was blasting, but the sheer, biting cold of the blizzard outside seeped through the floorboards, chilling the marrow in my bones. The heavy halogen headlights carved a narrow, yellow tunnel through the swirling whiteout conditions. We were miles from the nearest neighbor. We were completely alone in the vast, frozen wilderness, until the headlights caught a small, pale figure standing dead in the center of the icy asphalt. Arthur violently slammed on the brakes. The heavy truck fishtailed, the tires screaming against the ice before shuddering to a halt mere feet from the figure. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I peered through the rhythmic slapping of the windshield wipers. It was a child. A little girl, no older than 7, was standing completely alone in the pitch-black snow. She was wearing a thin, filthy white nightgown that was entirely inadequate for the sub-zero temperatures. She had no coat, no shoes, and her long, tangled black hair hung in thick, wet ropes over her face. She wasn't shivering. She was standing perfectly, unnaturally still, her bare, pale feet planted firmly on the freezing black ice. "Jesus Christ," Arthur breathed, throwing the truck into park and grabbing his heavy coat. "What the hell is a kid doing out here?" We both scrambled out of the truck, the bitter wind instantly stealing the breath from my lungs. I rushed forward, falling to my knees on the icy road right in front of her. "Sweetheart? Oh my God, you're freezing," I gasped, my maternal instincts entirely overriding my shock. I reached out and touched her shoulder. Her skin was as cold and rigid as marble. "Who are you? What are you doing out here so late?" The little girl slowly raised her head. Her face was completely devoid of emotion, a blank, porcelain mask of pale skin. She didn't speak. She just raised a tiny, freezing hand and pointed a pale finger vaguely into the distance, toward the absolute, suffocating darkness of the deep woods where there were no houses, no roads, and no light. "She wants to go home," Arthur said, his voice thick with concern, stepping up beside me and wrapping his heavy flannel jacket around her small shoulders. "Her parents must be out of their minds with worry. We have to get her out of this weather before she freezes to death." "Oh, poor thing, she is all alone," I whispered, my heart aching with an immense, overwhelming sympathy. That was the moment. That was the exact fraction of a second where I damned my entire bloodline. We are warned in old folklore that true, ancient evil cannot simply cross the threshold of a righteous home. It has to be invited. It uses illusion, tragedy, and trickery to manipulate human empathy. It masquerades as something weak, lost, or injured, waiting for a good person to open the door so it can rot the household from the inside out. I didn't know I was holding a demon. I thought I was holding a frightened child. We brought her directly into our warm, isolated cabin. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind us, sealing us inside with the freezing winter, and with her, our 8-year-old son, Tommy, was awake, sitting by the massive stone hearth in the living room, wrapped in a quilt. He was a sweet, incredibly gentle boy with a heart too big for his own chest. When he saw Arthur and me walk in with the strange, silent girl, his eyes lit up with innocent curiosity. "I found her on the road, Tommy. She's lost," I explained softly, guiding the girl toward the warmth of the roaring fire. Tommy immediately dropped his quilt and rushed over, an earnest, welcoming smile on his face. "Hi, I am Tommy. What is your name?" The girl just stared at him. Her eyes were dark, unblinking, and entirely hollow. She remained completely silent, her face a rigid mask. We gathered around her, the three of us practically suffocating her with warmth and desperate questions. Arthur knelt down, using his gentle, fatherly voice. "Can you tell us your name, kiddo? Can you tell us where your mom and dad are?" Nothing. She didn't flinch. She didn't acknowledge the questions. She just stared at Tommy with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "She must be in shock," I murmured, rubbing my arms to dispel a sudden, deep chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather. "We'll let her warm up. We'll call the sheriff first thing in the morning when the phone lines thaw." "She looks like a porcelain doll," Tommy whispered, his innocent fascination overriding any sense of stranger danger. "Can I call her Abigail? She looks like an Abigail." Before I could answer, the first warning sign manifested. The heavy, wrought iron chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling of the cabin suddenly let out a sharp, electrical crack. The heavy amber bulbs began to violently flicker. It wasn't the rhythmic dimming of a struggling generator. It was an intense, aggressive, almost strobe-like surging. The lights buzzed with a deafening, insectoid hum, casting wild, chaotic, stretching shadows against the log walls. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly, our breath pluming into thick white clouds. "Just a power surge from the storm," Arthur muttered, eyeing the ceiling suspiciously as the lights finally settled back into a dim, sickly yellow glow. But the air in the cabin felt different now. Felt heavy, felt toxic. The next morning, the suffocating reality of our family dynamic demanded our attention. While Tommy took it upon himself to welcome Abigail, offering to show her his bedroom and his collection of wooden toy trucks, Arthur and I sat in the kitchen, nursing black coffee and speaking in hushed, emotionally shattered tones. The heavy burden of our household lived at the very end of the downstairs hallway, behind a thick oak door fitted with 2 heavy brass padlocks. It was Arthur's father, Elias. Elias was a former logger, a mountain of a man who had been hollowed out by a severe, aggressively degrading form of dementia. Over the past year, his mind had entirely shattered. He didn't just forget who we were. He became erratic, deeply paranoid, and physically dangerous to himself and others. We had been forced to modify his bedroom, removing anything sharp or heavy, and keeping the door locked from the outside to prevent him from wandering out into the freezing woods in the middle of the night. "I can't take much more of this, Clara," Arthur whispered, burying his face in his calloused hands. His voice was thick with heavy, masculine grief. I heard him screaming at the walls again at 3 in the morning. "He doesn't even know I'm his son anymore. He looked at me yesterday like I was a stranger breaking into his house." I reached across the wooden table, taking his trembling hand in mine. "I know, Arthur. It's a waking nightmare, but we're keeping him safe. God is great, and He won't give us more than we can carry. We just have to keep praying for a moment of clarity for him." Arthur nodded, tears welling in his exhausted eyes. The emotional toll of locking his own father in a room was slowly killing him. Just then, Tommy walked past the kitchen doorway, holding the silent, pale girl by the hand. He smiled at us, entirely unbothered by her terrifying silence. "I'm going to help Grandpa Elias go to the bathroom," Tommy announced proudly. "Be careful, buddy. Lock the door right behind him," Arthur called out, his voice instantly shifting to a protective tone. I watched from the kitchen as my sweet, innocent son unlocked the heavy brass padlocks. He guided his frail, confused grandfather out of the room, patiently walking the old man to the bathroom, and then carefully leading him back to his bed. Tommy pulled the heavy oak door shut, the loud clack of the padlocks echoing down the wooden hallway. It was a routine we had perfected to keep the old man safe. Looking back, it breaks my heart to remember how perfect our little world was. Even with Elias's illness, there was so much love in our house. Our nearest neighbor, a widow named Sarah who lived 2 miles down the mountain, would always say we were the kindest folks in the county. Sarah's daughter, a bright-eyed little girl named Chloe, was Tommy's absolute best friend. Our families were incredibly close. We were honest, giving people who would open our doors to anyone in need. But everything fractured the moment we pulled that girl from the ice. We brought a parasite into our sanctuary, and the slaughter was about to begin. The suffocating tension inside the cabin broke violently just after twilight. I was in the kitchen, washing the dinner plates in the cast-iron sink, listening to the relentless howling of the mountain wind battering the frosted window panes. "Mom! Mom! I forgot!" Tommy's scream tore through the quiet of the house, raw and laced with sudden, absolute panic. I dropped the ceramic plate. It shattered against the porcelain sink, but I didn't stop to look. I sprinted out of the kitchen and into the main living room. Tommy was standing at the edge of the long, dark wooden hallway that led to the bedrooms, his small hands clutching his head, his face entirely drained of color. "I forgot the locks, Mom. I didn't snap the locks shut when I took Grandpa back," he shrieked, tears of sheer terror instantly spilling down his cheeks. My heart seized. A cold, heavy stone of dread dropped into my stomach. I grabbed a heavy iron flashlight from the mantel and ran past my son, my boots pounding against the floorboards. The hallway was unlit, a tunnel of thick, suffocating shadows. As I reached the end of the corridor, my worst fear was confirmed. The heavy oak door to Elias's room was wide open. The 2 thick brass padlocks hung uselessly from their metal hasps. The air pouring out of the bedroom was completely wrong. It didn't just smell like stale sweat and old age anymore. It smelled like wet, rotting earth and old copper. "Arthur, get in here," I screamed over my shoulder, clicking the heavy flashlight on and shining the beam into the pitch-black room. Arthur's heavy boots thundered down the hall behind me. I swept the yellow beam across the bare mattress, the bolted-down dresser, the heavily barred window. The bed was empty. "Dad? Dad, where are you?" Arthur called out, his voice shaking as he pushed past me into the freezing room. I swept the beam into the far corner of the room. Elias was standing there, but his posture sent a violent, agonizing shockwave of terror straight through my nervous system. He wasn't hunched over in his usual state of confused frailty. The old man was standing completely rigid, his spine unnaturally straight, his face pressed flush against the raw timber of the log wall. He was dragging his cracked, bleeding fingernails slowly down the wood, over and over again in a hypnotic, rhythmic trance. He was whispering. It wasn't his usual paranoid rambling. He was speaking in a frantic, overlapping cadence, his voice entirely devoid of inflection, like a broken radio playing a distress signal. She's in the walls, she's in the walls. The cold girl brought the dark. She's in the walls, she's in the walls. Dad, hey, it's okay. I'm here, Arthur said gently, stepping forward and placing a firm hand on the old man's shoulder to pull him away from the timber. The moment Arthur touched him, Elias violently whipped his head around. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely feral. He didn't look at Arthur. He looked directly past us, staring out into the dark hallway where Tommy was standing, trembling. And right behind Tommy, barely illuminated by the ambient glow of the living room fire, was Abigail. She was standing perfectly still, her hollow black eyes locked onto the old man. Elias opened his mouth and let out a guttural, animalistic hiss, shrinking away from the open doorway and cowering into the corner like a beaten dog. Arthur quickly guided his terrified father back into the bed, pulling the heavy wool blankets over him. We stepped out, and I slammed the heavy oak door shut, violently snapping both brass padlocks into place. I leaned against the wood, my chest heaving, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Arthur looked at me, his face pale and drawn. We both knew something in the house had fundamentally shifted, but we were too blind to see the parasite standing right in our hallway. The next morning, the blizzard outside had slightly broken, leaving the world buried under 3 feet of blinding, pristine white snow. The tension in the kitchen, however, was thick enough to choke on. Arthur was aggressively lacing up his heavy leatherwork boots by the wood stove, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute determination. "We are taking her into Blackwood today, Clara," Arthur stated, not looking up. "We are taking her straight to the sheriff's station. We cannot keep a stray kid in this house. Not with my dad's condition deteriorating like this. It isn't safe." "No, she stays." Tommy burst into the kitchen, his face red with sudden, uncharacteristic rage. He ran over and stood protectively in front of Abigail, who was sitting silently at the wooden table, staring blankly at a bowl of oatmeal. "She's supposed to stay with us forever. She's my friend." "Tommy, lower your voice," Arthur snapped, standing up to his full, imposing height. "Her parents are probably tearing the mountains apart looking for her. She doesn't belong here." I looked at the pale, silent girl sitting at my table. In that moment, a bizarre, unnatural wave of overwhelming maternal devotion washed over me. It felt thick and suffocating, completely overriding my logic. It was the entity actively manipulating my empathy, weaving a blindfold over my survival instincts. "Arthur, look at her," I pleaded, walking over and placing my hand gently on the girl's freezing, rigid shoulder. "She completes our family. Tommy has been so lonely out here in the woods. Let her stay a few more days, just until the roads are fully plowed." Arthur stared at me in profound disbelief. "Clara, have you lost your mind? She is a human child, not a stray dog. Keeping her is practically kidnapping. When her real parents show up, Tommy's heart is going to be completely shattered." Arthur didn't wait for me to argue. He marched over to the heavy rotary phone mounted on the kitchen wall and aggressively dialed the operator. He asked to be connected to Sheriff Miller at the Blackwood station. The line crackled with heavy static from the storm. "Miller? It's Arthur. Up on the ridge." Arthur spoke into the receiver, his voice tight. "Listen, I found a little girl wandering on Highway 101 last night in the dead of the storm. Black hair, white nightgown, won't speak a single word. Has anyone reported a missing kid? Arthur paused, listening to the static-laced reply, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. No one? Not a single call. He sighed heavily, rubbing the bridge of his nose. All right, the pass is still iced over. I'll shelter her here temporarily, but the second you get a claimant, you send a cruiser up the mountain to get her. He slammed the heavy receiver back onto the cradle. He grabbed his keys from the counter and shrugged on his heavy flannel coat. I have to get down to the mill. We have a massive timber delivery going out to Seattle today, and I'm already 3 hours behind. Keep the doors locked. Don't let her wander outside. Arthur kissed my cheek, a quick, tense gesture, and walked out the heavy front door. I watched through the frosted glass as he climbed into his massive Ford pickup, the heavy engine roaring to life, and slowly crunched his way down the icy driveway, disappearing into the suffocating wall of green pines. I was left completely alone with the old man locked in the back room, my son, and the parasite. I went back to the kitchen sink to finish the dishes, trying to shake the heavy, oppressive dread clinging to my skin. In the living room, Tommy was joyfully opening his wooden toy chest. He was pulling out his carved wooden trucks and a heavy, antique metal train set, proudly showing every piece to Abigail. "This one is my favorite," I heard Tommy say, his voice echoing slightly in the large, vaulted room. "My dad carved it from a piece of oak. Do you want to hold it?" I smiled softly to myself, the manipulated maternal warmth returning. Tommy was so gentle. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic clatter echoed from the living room, followed by a soft, wet tearing sound. "Mom!" Tommy called out. His voice wasn't panicked this time, just slightly concerned. Abigail cut her hand on the metal train track. "She's bleeding." "I'm coming, sweetie. Don't let her touch anything," I called back, quickly drying my hands on my apron. I rushed to the downstairs bathroom, opening the medicine cabinet and pulling out the heavy metal first aid kit. I grabbed a roll of white gauze, a bottle of iodine, and a clean rag, then hurried into the living room. Abigail was standing perfectly still in the center of the braided rug. She had her right arm extended, her palm facing upward. A deep, jagged slice ran across the center of her pale hand. "Oh, sweetheart, let me see that. Let's get it cleaned up," I murmured, dropping to my knees in front of her. I took her freezing wrist in my hand and raised her palm to the light. I froze. The breath was instantly, violently snatched from my lungs. My entire reality fractured in a single, horrifying second. The blood pouring from the deep wound in her hand wasn't crimson. It wasn't human. It was a thick, luminescent, violently bright shade of neon blue. It didn't drip like liquid. It oozed like thick, toxic sludge. As it welled up from the split, pale skin, it gave off a faint, sickening hiss, burning a small, smoking hole directly through the fabric of the braided rug where it landed. The smell hitting my nose wasn't the metallic tang of iron. It smelled strongly of ozone, stagnant swamp water, and rotting sulfur. I stared at the glowing blue fluid, my mind completely rejecting the visual information. My hands began to shake so violently I dropped the roll of white gauze. It rolled across the floorboards, soaking up a drop of the blue sludge and instantly turning a foul, rotting black. I slowly looked up from the wound, my neck creaking with terror, and looked directly into Abigail's face. She wasn't staring blankly anymore. The corners of her pale lips were slowly, agonizingly pulling upward into a wide, malicious, deeply unnatural smile. Her bottomless black eyes locked onto mine, devoid of a single shred of humanity. It was the face of a predator staring at cornered prey. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, my heart thrashing wildly against my ribs. "Tommy?" I gasped, my voice a strangled, breathless croak. "Tommy, get away from her. Come here right now." My son was standing just a few feet behind the entity, but he didn't move. "Tommy!" I screamed, the maternal terror finally shattering the unnatural calm she had forced upon me. I looked at my beautiful, sweet boy, and my soul shattered into a million pieces. He was completely gone. Tommy was standing rigidly straight, his arms hanging limply at his sides. His face was entirely slack, stripped of all emotion and warmth. But it was his eyes that destroyed me. They were completely glazed over, a milky, dead white film covering his irises. He was staring blindly ahead, not looking at me, not looking at Abigail, just staring into the void. He wasn't breathing naturally. His chest hitched in short, mechanical, jagged movements. The entity hadn't just been standing in my house. She had been actively burrowing into my son's mind. The sweet, welcoming interactions Tommy had been having with her weren't acts of friendship. They were the methodical programming of a victim. Abigail had cast a deep, impenetrable hypnotic spell over him. Tommy was no longer acting on his own free will. He was completely possessed, a hollowed-out meat puppet waiting for the demon's silent, mental commands. And as I sat paralyzed on the living room floor, staring at the glowing blue blood dripping from the monster's hand, I realized with absolute, horrifying certainty that we had locked ourselves in a cage with an apex predator, and the slaughter had officially begun. The little girl didn't say a single word. She simply tilted her head, her bottomless black eyes completely devoid of human empathy, and blinked once. That was the silent mental command. Tommy instantly pivoted on his heel. His movements were terrifyingly rigid, stripped of all the bouncy, chaotic energy of an 8-year-old boy. His arms hung dead at his sides. He marched past me with heavy, mechanical footsteps, completely ignoring my hysterical, sobbing pleas. He walked straight toward the heavy wooden staircase that led to the third-story loft, a high, vaulted balcony that hung precariously over the jagged, frozen ravine behind our cabin, a sheer 50-foot drop onto solid granite boulders. "Tommy, stop! Tommy, look at Mommy. Please stop!" I shrieked, scrambling to my feet. I lunged for his waist, desperate to tackle him to the floor. But the moment I moved toward him, an invisible, crushing weight slammed into my chest. It felt like the air pressure in the room had violently tripled. I hit the hardwood floor, gasping for breath, my vision swimming with black spots. The entity wasn't touching me, but the sheer, oppressive force of her demonic aura pinned me to the floorboards like a heavy iron sheet. I watched in absolute, paralyzed horror as my sweet boy methodically climbed the stairs, step by step, disappearing into the shadows of the loft. With a primal scream that tore my vocal cords, I fought through the supernatural gravity. I dragged myself up the stairs on my hands and knees, my fingernails splintering against the raw oak. "Tommy!" I reached the loft landing just as he opened the heavy glass balcony door. The freezing blizzard violently whipped into the cabin, instantly covering the floorboards with a layer of white snow. Tommy didn't hesitate. He didn't shiver. He climbed directly onto the icy wooden railing, balancing precariously over the abyss. "Tommy, please, I am begging you, don't jump," I wailed, reaching my hand out through the freezing wind. For a fraction of a second, the milky, dead film cleared from his eyes. He looked back at me over his shoulder. The pure, innocent terror returned to his face. He was trapped inside his own body, a prisoner watching his own execution. A single tear cut through the snow on his cheek, and then, completely devoid of his own free will, his legs propelled him forward. He plummeted into the whiteout. The sound of his small body hitting the jagged granite boulders at the bottom of the ravine was a sickening, wet crack that will violently echo in my nightmares until the day I die. "No!" I screamed, a sound of such profound, shattered agony that it didn't even sound human. I didn't think about the monster downstairs. I didn't think about anything. I sprinted down the stairs, threw open the back door, and plunged waist deep into the freezing snow, sliding recklessly down the steep embankment of the ravine. I dug through the snowdrifts until my hands found him. His skull was catastrophically fractured. The pure, crimson red of his blood was rapidly pooling out onto the pristine white snow, a horrifying contrast to the glowing blue sludge of the demon that had put him there. He was still breathing, but it was a wet, ragged, agonizing rattle. I scooped his broken body into my arms, screaming for help into the empty, howling wilderness. I dragged him back up the embankment, kicking the back door shut behind me, completely ignoring the empty living room where the girl had been standing. I laid him on the kitchen table and lunged for the heavy rotary phone on the wall. My fingers were covered in my son's blood, slipping wildly on the plastic dial as I called the Blackwood Lumber Mill. "Arthur! Arthur! Pick up!" I shrieked into the receiver the second the line connected. "Clara? Clara, what's wrong? I can barely hear you over the sirens." Arthur's voice was frantic, chaotic, completely drowned out by the sound of screaming men and heavy machinery in the background. "Tommy jumped," I sobbed, my voice breaking into a hysterical, hyperventilating wail. "She did something to him, Arthur. He threw himself off the loft. His head is cracked. There's so much blood. I'm wrapping him in blankets and driving him down the pass to Doc Evans' clinic right now. Oh my God. Oh my God. Clara, listen to me," Arthur yelled, his voice cracking with sheer panic and profound despair. "I can't get to you. The roof of the main mill just catastrophically collapsed under the weight of the ice. The metal beams came down. Half my crew is crushed underneath. We have dead men in the snow, Clara. The sheriff has the whole site locked down. We are digging them out with our bare hands." The tragedy was a coordinated, localized strike. The entity wasn't just attacking our house. It was manipulating the environment to ensure we were completely isolated, keeping Arthur trapped miles away while it slaughtered us. "I can't wait for you. I have to take him now," I cried. "Go. Drive like hell," Arthur ordered. I radioed Sarah 2 minutes ago before the lines started going down. I asked her to send Chloe up on her snowshoes to watch the little girl while we deal with the mill. Chloe should be at the cabin any minute. Leave the girl with her and get our boy to the doctor. The line violently clicked dead, consumed by heavy static. I wrapped Tommy's bleeding head in thick towels, carried him to the truck, and sped down the treacherous mountain pass, the tires sliding wildly on the black ice. I left the cabin behind. I did not know that by leaving, I was condemning another innocent life. I did not know that Sarah, sitting in her warm kitchen 2 miles down the mountain, happily cooking a pot of stew for her daughter's return, was completely unaware that her child was walking directly into a slaughterhouse. Because when Chloe arrived at our cabin, she didn't find a frightened little girl. She found an apex predator waiting in the dark. I wasn't there to see it, but the grisly aftermath painted a perfect, horrifying picture. Chloe had walked into the silent, pitch-black cabin, brushing the snow off her coat, calling out softly for Abigail. She had wandered down the dark hallway. That was when she noticed the heavy brass padlocks on Elias's bedroom door hadn't been picked or broken. They had been completely melted straight through the metal by thick, burning drops of neon blue acid. The demon had unleashed the grandfather first, slaughtering the old man in his bed before dragging his body into the shadows. And when Chloe turned around to run, the entity ambushed her from the ceiling. It didn't use a weapon. It used its bare, pale hands to violently tear the poor, sweet teenager apart in the dark. 2 hours later, I stood in the sterile, blindingly white hallway of Doc Evans Mountain Clinic. My hands were stained crimson. The doctor emerged from the emergency room, his face pale, his eyes completely hollow. He didn't have to say a word. He just slowly shook his head. My sweet, innocent 8-year-old boy was dead. I collapsed against the linoleum wall, sliding down to the floor, my mind entirely shattering into absolute, numb oblivion. I don't remember dialing the phone in the lobby. I just remember Arthur's broken, sobbing voice on the other end. "I'm still trapped at the mill, Clara. The roads are completely blocked by the emergency vehicles." Arthur wept, the heavy weight of his grief completely destroying him. "Go home. Please, God, just go home. Go rest. I will get there the absolute second they clear the wreckage." I drove back up the mountain in a trance. I was no longer a living woman. I was a ghost haunting my own body. When I finally pulled the truck up to the dark cabin, the blizzard had stopped. The woods were dead quiet. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped into the pitch-black living room. The fire had completely died out. The air inside the house was freezing, smelling heavily of copper, voided bowels, and that thick, putrid scent of stagnant swamp water. I didn't turn on the lights. I just stood in the center of the dark living room, staring blankly at the wall. "He screamed for you, you know?" The voice cut through the silence like a rusted scalpel. It wasn't the guttural hiss of an animal. It was a perfectly clear, chillingly calm, melodic voice. I slowly turned my head. Standing in the shadows near the kitchen doorway was Abigail. She was no longer covered in the glowing blue blood. She looked perfectly clean. "Abigail, you can speak?" I whispered, my voice completely dead, hollowed out by my grief. The corners of her mouth stretched into a terrifying, impossible smile that pulled the skin of her cheeks taut. "I can do much more than speak, Clara. I've been very busy while you were gone." She tilted her head, her black eyes gleaming with pure, unadulterated malice. "I broke them all." The old man in the back room squealed like a pig when I peeled the skin from his face. And the neighbor girl, Chloe, she tasted so sweet when she stopped fighting back. A wave of profound, mind-breaking horror washed over me. I stumbled backward, my knees hitting the floorboards. Suddenly, the front door violently burst open. Arthur stood in the doorway, his heavy coat covered in sawdust, grease, and the blood of his crushed crew. He took one step into the house, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. He saw the massive pool of blood seeping out from the dark hallway where Chloe's and Elias's bodies had been dragged. He dropped to his knees, letting out a roar of absolute, agonizing despair. He looked at the little girl standing in the kitchen doorway, his face twisting into a mask of pure, violent rage. "Where did you come from?" Arthur screamed, his voice tearing his throat raw, tears streaming down his soot-stained face. "Why are you torturing us? Why are you killing us one by one? We gave you warmth. We gave you food. We did absolutely nothing but try to help you." Abigail didn't flinch. She just stared down at my broken husband and began to laugh. It wasn't the laugh of a child. It was a deep, resonant, overlapping chorus of ancient, rotting voices vibrating from her throat. As she laughed, her physical form began to violently break down. The pale, porcelain skin of her face cracked and split apart like dried clay, falling away in large, fleshy chunks. Beneath the human disguise, there was no skull. There was only a writhing, pulsing mass of black, rotting grave dirt and glowing blue veins. Her white nightgown shredded as her limbs elongated, snapping and reforming into a towering, grotesque silhouette of shadow and rot that scraped against the vaulted ceiling of the cabin. I am a demon born directly inside the rot of a grave. The entity boomed, its true voice shaking the heavy timber walls of the cabin, vibrating in the fillings of our teeth. I was not born to be saved. I was born to consume. The massive, terrifying entity leaned down, its breath smelling like a freshly opened tomb, staring directly into Arthur's weeping eyes. My absolute purpose is to entirely eliminate goodness from this earth. It hissed, the venom in its words burning like acid. You are pure. You are kind-hearted. And that is exactly why your entire bloodline had to be slaughtered. You opened the door. You invited the rot inside. The entity raised a massive, shadow-drenched claw, the glowing blue fluid dripping from its jagged, elongated talons, and brought it down violently toward my husband. That is the last thing I remember before the cabin was completely consumed by darkness. The police never discovered the actual cause of the physical deaths. When the sheriff finally made it up the mountain the next morning, they found my husband, my father-in-law, and the neighbor's daughter completely torn to shreds, their bodies mutilated beyond human recognition. I was the only one left alive, sitting catatonic in the freezing snow outside the cabin, staring blankly at the tree line. The little girl in the white nightgown was gone. I am telling you this because you need to understand the absolute truth about the dark. Malicious spirits and ancient evils do not break into your house with a crowbar. They use illusion. They manipulate your deepest, most profound human empathy. Because certain evil energies cannot cross the threshold of a good, righteous home on their own, they will pretend to be weak. They will pretend to be lost. They will pretend to be an injured child freezing in the snow. They will wait for a good person to invite them inside. And once they cross that threshold, they will completely destroy your family from within. Never stop for the crying child on a dark road. Never open your door to the lost thing in the woods. Keep driving. Let it freeze.